Walking the Trump White House again today, this time featuring confirmed visits to the notorious Epstein Island, where the man you see on your screen, along with the president, Trump's commerce chief, visited. A confession he made for the first time today after many years of lying about it. There are several strands to this story we'll get into, but we begin with really something right out of a movie plot. And we've been reporting on this. If it sounds familiar, you may remember the evidence in the timeline that we've been showing you. What you see on the timeline includes Mr. Lutnick, who had said that he cut off all contact with Epstein. All contact. Dinners in New York, emails, what have you. And you see there later, Epstein talked about blackmail. So he was accusing this man he said he'd cut off all contact with of blackmail, something that Pam Bondi and others inside DOJ say still didn't happen. And yet those 3 million new files that you see on the far right part of our timeline included Lutnick emailing about visiting the island, which put a lot of pressure on his public denials. And today, what we've been tracking here and what so many in Congress, of course, and independent investigators and journalists have been tracking has now blown up in Mr. Lutnick's face in the White House. Lutnick confessing only now that he's under oath today, faced with the damning emails that we've reported, that we told you about, that others, including the survivors, demanded be released precisely because they didn't believe people like Mr. Lutnick, who made a big show of both denying any past contact with Epstein, having cut off contact, he said, and still talking about him. And I'll show you about some of what he said because it fits into the larger question about how high this goes in the United States government. These are also files and emails that President Trump has tried to hide for years. And so while there might be a kind of dramatic, or some would even say prurient interest in some of this, believe me, honest law enforcement prosecutors, to say nothing of the survivors, care a lot about why these lies go to the top of the Trump administration. And even today, there's no accountability, apparently. Donald Trump standing by Lutnick, standing by him even as he visited the island and lied about it. There's also reports today that we discussed last night with one of the journalists who broke the story that another part of the file suggests that Trump was telling law enforcement he knew a lot about Epstein's crimes, or alleged at the time of what were allegations, in Florida. So I'm going to show you more of that tonight. There are different strands of this, as I said, but we've zeroed in on Lutnick precisely because it's a big problem to have these kind of people exercising power when they feel, whatever their motivations are, the need to lie about their history with Epstein. So he testified now today that he visited the island in 2012. So we know he's been lying about that for years, as mentioned, as we showed you on the timeline. Now, what's different? Well, the files are out, putting on the pressure, and lying about it today would have risked committing a perjury crime. Those other lies that I'll show you were in public, not under oath. Bottom line, Lutnick is now retracting something he's lied about for many years, claiming that in 2005, he cut off ties with Epstein. And if you happen to watch this program regularly, you may recall that we've discussed this. We discussed what the evidence was amounting to. Last night on this program, I was careful to note that Lutnick had not addressed this or clarified the emails. And so while the emails suggested he went to the island, we weren't even reporting that yet as fact because it had not been fully confirmed. Now Lutnick confesses. Trump White House stands by him. There are many questions remaining, including if it was an innocuous visit with his family, why go to such great lengths to hide it? Senator Van Hollen hammering Lutnick today.
Said you were disgusted, would never have any contact with him again. Did you, in fact, make the visit to Jeffrey Epstein's private island?
I did have lunch with him as I was on a boat going across on a family vacation. To suggest there was anything untoward about that in 2012, I don't recall why we did it, but
Mr. Secretary, again, as I said, there's not an indication that you yourself engaged in any wrongdoing with Jeffrey Epstein. It's the fact that you believe that you misled the country and the Congress based on your earlier statements, suggesting that you'd cut off all contact when, in fact, you had not. You realize that, this visit took place after he'd been convicted, right?
It went on like that, the senator sort of trying to address this fairly. No one who cares about the actual facts is trying to do guilt by association. In other words, those emails regarding the visit, which show that he lied about it. Only he knows why he lied about it. But that is completely separate from other material that suggests, like we showed the other day, a DOJ suspect list that suggests people were involved in, for example, the crimes. What was a sex trafficking ring? As the senator said, and I'll repeat for clarity, Mr. Lutnick's not accused of that kind of thing. But he kept lying about this in an almost dramatic fashion, which I'll show you. So he says he visited the island with his family, with his wife, kids, and nanny. And as you mentioned, as I should say, as Van Hollen mentioned, that's the state of play. But why lie about that if it was just that? And are we getting the whole truth now when the only thing he's admitting to, copping to, is what's caught up in the emails? Are there other meetings? Was there other help? Remember, one of the key points about why this is bigger than just a personal scandal, which people could deal with, is the amount of evidence that suggests Mr. Epstein was given special treatment, which allowed him to continue these crime sprees, which hurt all these people. So now you have someone who's caught lying about this, who's in the Trump cabinet, who's part of this group of people who have ties to Epstein, who were hiding it. And this is the same guy, as I'll show you, who says Epstein was a blackmailer, which, again, the government has not confirmed or charged him for. Now, the receipts go a long way. It was 2012 when Lutnick wrote, "Hi, Jeff. We're landing in St. Thomas early Saturday afternoon, planning to head over to St. Bart's/Anguilla on Monday at some point. Where are you located? Exact location for my captain." So this sounds very much like trying to go definitely do the meetup. And Epstein said, "Come Saturday or Sunday lunch, Little St. James on the map, behind Christmas Cove." Lutnick responds, "Okay, lunch on Sunday. See you then." And later, an Epstein assistant sent the message to Lutnick, which included, quote, "Nice seeing you." This is what lawyers would call multiple corroboration contacts that suggest the meeting took place, although it's not like we have a photo or a video or that kind of record. Now, that's 2012. Lutnick claimed very publicly that the last time he actually saw Epstein was 7 years earlier.
I say to him, "Massage table in the middle of your house? How often you have a massage?" And he says, "Every day." And then he gets weirdly close to me. Ooh. And he says, "And the right kind of massage." Ooh. Now my wife is standing here. So she looks at me and I look at her and we say, "I'm sorry, we have to go." And we left. My wife and I decided that I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again.
So strongly worded with the narrative and the story and the kind of Trumpian imitation style we've seen many of his top officials do, where they're trying to maybe be like the boss or create content or have these sort of big stories about what is obviously a matter of public interest. The problem is he was lying. And nothing about the meeting or today's confession suggests that he got confused and forgot, but rather this was a kind of brash, big lie, a way to say, well, I definitely cut it all off. And meanwhile, he and apparently his wife, who's only in this because of him, no one's throwing a lot of stones at her publicly, did go back and see him. How many times? Well, he's admitting 2 and denying any wrongdoing. And the White House says Trump stands by Lutnick. Of all the people who could continue to play these roles funded by you, the taxpayer, the president wants to keep on board someone who's been caught visiting Epstein Island, even if it was apparently on the records just for lunch. There's also new evidence from the files about Epstein's recording, which relates to something I'm going to quote Lutnick on, these questions about what Epstein was up to. These photos show a camera perched over a suite of bathrooms. Other photos reveal what could be a kind of elaborate long-term surveillance room, because the door says, and is it truth in labeling or not, but it says 24-hour surveillance. The files have new details about how Epstein had one of the people in his employ work on small hidden cameras. This was back in 2014. The aide responding, "I'm installing them into Kleenex boxes now." Remember what we've said. These files, millions of them are voluminous. The New York Times tracked this down and did the other corroborative reporting. You can't just necessarily learn something from each random email, but there are many stories in the Times and other papers right now, and we've done our own reporting, as we've told you, pulling on these threads. The new revelations we got First, here on The Beat last night from Miami Herald journalist Julie K. Brown recorded how in July '06, Trump called the Palm Beach police chief at the time and saying Epstein's activities with teenage girls were well known. Thank goodness you're stopping them. Everyone has known he's been doing this, which, as I've mentioned, could be a positive if you say that's a person in the community talking to law enforcement in the service of potentially stopping something bad. Of course, it's Trump who is tied back into this in many ways, socially and otherwise. We're learning this because apparently the chief told the FBI this in a 2019 interview, which would have stayed secret except for the files coming out. Trump telling the chief, allegedly, or at least according to his account, that he was around Epstein once. When teenagers were present, Trump got the hell out of there. Again, that would sound like a good thing, and yet it also contradicts what we've seen Trump and some of his officials seem to want to do to create distance from Epstein when he became such a public, toxic national story. For example, here was Donald Trump in 2019.
No, I had no idea. I had no idea. I haven't spoken to him in many, many years, but I did have no idea.
To deny what was then a controversy, he said he had no idea. This police chief, who again was talking to the FBI in 2019, would seem to be credible. He knows he has to tell the truth or face legal sanction when you talk to the feds, and was also someone who had credibility because he had tried to go after Epstein and was interfered with by Washington, if you remember the timeline and those problems. This chief says Trump also seemed to know about how it operationally worked. That Maxwell, who at the time might have been seen to outsiders as just a woman in Epstein's orbit, that the chief remembered Trump said she was evil. Writer telling the FBI Trump revealed Epstein's associate was the operative, that she was evil. Focus on her, he said. And so, again, we're dealt with situations here that can be complex. If a person really was trying to help law enforcement go get Epstein and Maxwell for the right reason, that could be a good thing. But why would that same person go to such lengths to publicly lie about that knowledge? And newly relevant, Trump won't even rule out a pardon for Maxwell, who, again, the FBI chief says he knew all the way back then was evil. We've heard that Maxwell is prepared to speak honestly if only granted clemency by Trump. She pled the fifth yesterday.
Aware of Donald Trump ever engaging in sexual activity with an individual introduced to him by you or Jeffrey Epstein?
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence.
That's what it looks like. Are we in the middle of this story after all these years? Are we near the end? Or could we be something more like just past the beginning? It depends on what you've learned about it and whether you think it is an over kind of dead issue with everything solved, or a lot of open strands finally coming out. Here's a Republican senator's reaction to having learned a bit more about the files.
I've not been one of the members who has glommed onto this as an issue. I've sort of intentionally deferred to others to find out about it. But 9-year-old victims of this. Well, initially, my reaction to all this was, I don't care. I don't know what the big deal is. But now, I see what the big deal is, and it was worth investigating, and the members of Congress that have been pushing this were not wrong.
That is a Republican from the very red state of Wyoming, where MAGA runs strong. So when she says she didn't want to look at it or she deferred to others, the politics of that we all know. She may have been in a place where even acknowledging this was worth looking at, let alone a problem, including the Trump DOJ's oversight, well, that may have been hard. And now, after all this, if you want to take her at her word, she is discovering it is a big deal and worth investigating. When she talks about the lawmakers who did push this, she's referring to people like Massey and Khanna from both parties. And here was Khanna after going in to look at the unredacted files.
There were 6 wealthy, powerful men that the DOJ hid for no apparent reason. When Congressman Massey and I pointed this out to the Department of Justice, they acknowledged their mistake. And now they have revealed the identity of these 6 powerful men. Now, my question is, why did it take Thomas Massie and me going to the Justice Department to get these 6 men's identities to become public? And if we found 6 men that they were hiding in 2 hours, imagine how many men they are covering up for in those 3 million files.
In that sense, the people who pushed to get the files out are now doing the work of going through them, as I mentioned. That's Kana. We reached out from MS Now to each of those named individuals. One, Wexner's legal representative responded, saying he was told by the DOJ he was viewed as a source of information about Epstein and was not, the lawyer says, viewed as a criminal target. Andrew Weissman is here on all of this when we're back in 90 seconds. We're joined by veteran prosecutor and FBI general counsel previously, Andrew Weissman, who's an MS Now legal analyst. Andrew, I mentioned several of these developments. I wanted to focus with you first on Lutnick because it reflects how many powerful people seem to be lying about this, even though, in fairness, we discussed in our reporting what is and is not alleged. Does it matter that he lied for so long? Does it matter that the president doesn't see this as any kind of issue?
Well, let's just remember he's a cabinet secretary. So I think that sort of answers that question. Is the public entitled to the truth from somebody who is not just in the government, who works for us, but is at that high level in the government? And this is one where, I guess I'm enough of a Puritan that my view is, of course we are. And we only have ourselves to blame if we let it slide. And again, I take the reporting that he did not, or there's no evidence that he did anything wrong with Mr. Epstein. I'm basing it solely on the fact that he very loudly and publicly claimed that he disassociated himself with Mr. Epstein, and we now know that is not true. And we're entitled to more from our public officials. And frankly, the higher up you are, the more responsible you are to be candid with the public.
And the big questions are whether the process as it's supposed to work, people investigate crimes. You've overseen all kinds of such projects, and then it goes forward rather than what, by the way, this administration in other contexts has been accused of, which is cherry picking what they want to attack and letting other crimes go quite dangerously in the politicization of DOJ. In that context, Pam Bondi very infamously said there was nothing else to see and no possible blackmail evidence. Lutnick, before today's confession, had been talking publicly about Epstein being a blackmailer. Take a look.
That's what his MO was, get a massage. And what happened in that massage room, I assume, was on video. This guy was the greatest blackmailer ever. Blackmailed people. That's how he had money.
Andrew?
Let's just remember that with Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche saying there's nothing to see here, that meant that they had seen and reviewed the evidence that you're reporting that the evidence that they said there's nothing to see here, that meant knew that what a cabinet secretary was saying about disassociating himself with Jeffrey Epstein was not true. These reporting in the files of Donald Trump saying that he was very aware in the early 2000s that Jeffrey Epstein had been engaged in this kind of conduct, and they knew that he had said the opposite publicly. So to me, just remember, this is news to us. It is not news to the FBI and DOJ and Pam Bondi representing and Todd Blanche representing to us that there's nothing to see here. So for everything that, when you're saying this is new and look at this and this shows X, Y, and Z, just remember that is information that the government was aware of when they said nothing to see here, we're not doing anything.
And so should they have looked deeper at what is described as a surveillance system, the clear efforts to create these videos? Do you think that they've released all the videos that they had?
No, so I think there's no question they have not done enough, and I think Congress needs to pick up the slack. One of the reasons I say that is Todd Blanche, in defending his sort of softball questions for Ghislaine Maxwell, said, well, just remember, we didn't have all of those emails. For instance, the emails between Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, where Jeffrey Epstein says, you know, we haven't heard from Donald Trump. He's the dog that didn't bark. And she responds essentially saying, you know, I was thinking the same thing. And he said, well, I didn't have that. We didn't get that. So to me, what Congress needs to do is find out what is the nature of the investigation, what was done, what was not done. That, by the way, may cross Republican and Democratic administrations. So be it. This is what it means to do an impartial, unbiased investigation. But they should call prosecutors. They should call agents. To your point, they could call the staff of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to find out where they interviewed, what information they have, and they can immunize Ghislaine Maxwell because she has taken the fifth, and there's a way to force her to actually testify, which prosecutors know, Congress knows. They can immunize her, and that takes away her Fifth Amendment, and then she has to answer questions. So if Congress really wanted to know the answers to her questions, they have the tools.
Right, you're giving that roadmap, and that raises the question of what they're really trying to do. They have lawyers, some of them are lawyers. I wanted to get into that with you, that roadmap of what would mean to put pressure on Maxwell. So, Andrew, let's do that. Stay with me, and we'll get into that after the break. We're back with Andrew Weissman. Andrew, there's been a lot of pressure on what we're going to learn out of these Epstein files. Is it more than, as I mentioned, the period interest of this or that photo? Some of that real work is happening, and that's a credit to some of the serious people involved. You write that Congress can do more than what the Republican-controlled committee did here with Maxwell. Congress can, quote, grant her a type of immunity, so she has to testify under oath. Her testimony cannot be used to prosecute her further, with an exception. She's already serving 20 years. Immunity will not reduce her current sentence. This is because you argue there is more to the story than what Todd Blanche seemed to get in his unusual political meeting with her.
So Congress called her to testify. And so presumably Congress wanted the answers. And Ghislaine Maxwell asserted the Fifth Amendment. And to be clear, she has a valid Fifth Amendment. In other words, she has an absolute constitutional right to say that she refuses to answer a question that would tend to incriminate her. And I think I could understand why she would assert the Fifth. We can point out that she didn't do that when she met for 2 days with Todd Blanche, but she still has a right to assert the Fifth Amendment. So normally you wouldn't want to give somebody immunity because you don't want to just be, oh, I want to give immunity to someone who committed a murder or someone who committed sex trafficking. You want to prosecute them. You don't want to immunize them. But that's not the situation here because she has been convicted. She is doing her 20 years and nothing about affording her immunity is going to take that away. And so the way that you can force somebody who asserts the Fifth to testify is to say that we will give you immunity, meaning that we will not use your answers to prosecute you further unless you lie to us. If she were to then lie, you can prosecute her for that. And that time would be actually consecutive to her current time. So if they're interested in getting the answers, and presumably that is why they called her, not to just have a performative display of her taking the Fifth, which I think would be improper, because it's a constitutional right you have, and there's nothing wrong with asserting it. If they really want the answers, and I think they should, and I don't think Todd Blanche, in my view, did a very good job of asking tough questions. We also have millions of documents now to confront her with key ones to ask for questions about what happened. They should go ahead and do that. And so I really think this is one where they have yet another avenue to do justice for the victims.
Yeah, I think you lay that out well, and it also speaks to what has been a clear breakdown in the system. Even Republicans, many conservatives have spoken out about how DOJ failed victims and didn't pursue these leads. That's partly under Donald Trump's DOJ. So here, not unlike the Jan 6 example, you have Congress using its subpoena and lawful powers. It could do more. Right. So it's interesting you say that. People out there can listen and make up their own mind. Thank you, Andrew. Right. For weeks, America has been roiled by those killings in Minnesota. Now, we should tell you, the DHS under Trump has finally had an official under oath for the first time. As Congress presses on that, we're going to show you what happened. And later in the hour, we've been talking Bad Bunny. Wait till you hear what Jon Stewart said by the end of the hour.